Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are in the world, we appreciate you being with us right now. This is Lovey Life, a DOM podcast. DOM is a digital and bilingual media company specialized in law at the supranational level. So, for all news, comments, analyses related to law in Africa and in the rest of the world, go to our website dom-online.com and follow us on our social media platforms, the links of which are listed below. This, however, is neither a technical nor a political podcast. To be honest, sometimes it's barely a legal one. The only prerequisite needed is to have an open mind and 30 minutes or so to spare. We sometimes will have guests from everywhere around the world, and we will always be keen to hear your thoughts. We have a fantastic episode for you today, so please stay with us and weigh in while we argue the case, Lovey Life. In today's broadcast, we are going to talk about statute of limitation and the fascinating ambivalence this legal mechanism seems to create in today's social climate in the perception of law and justice, using as a case study the Bill Cosby situation. These cases have captured the public attention in the US and indeed everywhere else, not only because of the reputation of Bill Cosby, but also because of the number of alleged victims that have come forward and the period of time in which these alleged unlawful acts have taken place. So, now that we have set the stage, let's present the cases, as in this instance, there are more than a dozen cases filed in both the criminal and the civil divisions of the US courts. This, by the way, is going to be significant later in this episode. The summary is going to be extremely brief, okay? It's simply for our listeners that are not acquainted with the facts, but also those who may be a bit confused as to the timeline and the actual proceedings. Bill, born William Cosby, is an American actor, producer, stand-up comedian that has been accused of having perpetrated sexual assaults and batteries on, at the time this program is recorded, approximately 60 women over at least 4 decades. The earliest incident having taken place in the mid-1960s, all the way up to the mid-2000s, in various states in the United States. Though these accusations have been levied against him, at this stage of the episode, it is important to state that he has maintained his innocence and repeatedly denied the allegations made against him over the years. Finally, we must also point out that most of the allegations were never tried in criminal courts because the alleged acts fell outside the statute of limitation. This brings me to the more technical aspect of our discussion, but we are going to make it as light as possible. When explaining why Bill Cosby has never been held criminally liable, media outlets and social commentators use interchangeably the terms prescription and limitation. That is not quite the same, and we need to spend a little bit of time on that difference, because it will be helpful, and also because I believe it is an important distinction everyone should be able to make. Very simply put, prescription is the consolidation of a legal situation by the passage of time. I cannot think of a simpler way to describe it. Under the doctrine of limitation, a plaintiff forgoes his or her right to file a complaint because he or she has left a certain amount of time elapse without manifesting his or her interest to exercise that option, which could happen for a multitude of reasons, obviously. If we were just to leave it at that, both terms, prescription and limitation, could be used synonymously, because they would refer essentially to the same mechanism. But prescription, i.e., the consolidation of a legal situation by the passage of time, is also paramount in the mechanism of usucapion, which is a process by which a person becomes the lawful owner of a property or right that was not his or hers to begin with after a certain time has passed, provided, of course, that other criteria are met. For the transfer of property to lawfully occur, the person must hold both the corpus, meaning have the actual possession of the thing or enjoy the right, and the animus, meaning the intention to act like the true owner of the property or the right in question. In addition to that, the possession must be useful, meaning free from vices. So, the possession must be continuous, peaceful, public, and unequivocal. To recap, both the doctrine of limitation and the mechanism of usucapion heavily rely on the passage of time, i.e., prescription. But, where in the former one relinquishes a right, in the latter one acquires a right. So from this point forward, we will be mainly talking about the doctrine of limitation. But at some point in the episode, we will go back to the principle of prescription. Okay? At the outset, we noted that Mr. Cosby was never criminally tried for the alleged act he was accused of. But several civil lawsuits have been filed over the years against him. Why is that? Without getting into details, it has mainly to do with very precise rules regarding the starting point and the length of the statute of limitation, which vary depending on the area of law, civil law, commercial law, criminal law, for example, and the nature of the infraction. Some infractions are immediate, and others happen over a long period of time. This is extremely important. Let's take, for example, the case of a murder. It is an instantaneous infraction. Therefore, the limitation period will start, depending on the circumstances, either from the moment the murder was committed, or, in very particular circumstances and very different places in the world, when it was discovered. Other infractions happen over a long period of time, and for those, the starting point for the limitation period is the moment the alleged unlawful behavior has stopped. There may also be events that suspend or interrupt the limitation period, resulting in a longer option to start legal proceedings. In the Cosby cases, we are dealing with sexual assault and/or batteries, which are usually instantaneous offenses, meaning that the statute of limitation starts the moment the unlawful act has been committed. But, in this particular case, some of his alleged victims contended that he drugged them beforehand, giving them a pill, which caused them to not remember everything, and some of them contended that they only realized what happened years later, when it was too late to file criminal charges against him, and sometimes civil charges as well. Other alleged victims have also stated that they were scared to come forward because of the status, fame, wealth, and aura of the actor. By the way, I say alleged victim here because, legally speaking, in many of these cases, though not all, as we're going to see in a minute, he was neither criminally nor civilly tried. So we have to respect the fact that in that regard, the presumption of innocence must be respected with all that it entails for some of his alleged victims. Although the criminal avenue was closed, a civil lawsuit, Constant versus Cosby, went ahead and was heard before a court. The defendant, Mr. Cosby, was sentenced on April 26, 2018 to 3 to 10 years in prison for aggravated indecent assault against the plaintiff, Ms. Constant. The judgment was later reversed by a decision of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania on June 30, 2021, the reading of which is absolutely fascinating for lawyers. But honestly, everyone can and should have a look at it, because it raises inter alia questions about the right to not self-incriminate, the admission of witnesses that are more prejudicial than probative, and the reliance on an agreement not to prosecute entered into with a prosecutor, i.e., a public official. Truly, truly, truly fascinating stuff. The whole affair is a treasure trove for legally inclined minds. But I digress. Mr. Cosby was freed regarding that particular case, but it is not the end of his legal battles, as he had another trial that was suspended during the time he spent in jail. That has been allowed to carry on. We are keeping an eye on that, because there too, there are some very interesting legal questions that the presiding judge will have to answer. We have talked about law a great deal so far. Let's take a step back and analyze the aftermath of the liberation of the man. The only word that comes to mind is fierce. For his supporters, justice was served. For his detractors, there was a miscarriage of justice, and he was freed on a technicality. I have to stop here for a second and say that as much as one may feel betrayed by quote-unquote the system, any lawyer, regardless of his or her personal opinion on the matter, will tell you that it was everything but a technicality. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, based on the element presented to it, really had no choice but to reverse the decision of the lower court, because it had admitted documents that were supposed to be sealed and confidential. We have to think outside of the particular case of Bill Cosby. The Supreme Court of a state, any state, cannot let the precedent stand that deals struck between informants and public officials can be broken once a new administration comes into power, effectively circumventing the constitutional right one has to not incriminate oneself. To be honest, it deserves a whole episode. Maybe we will do so if you are interested in it. Do let me know. Feeling so utterly betrayed by the outcome of the Constant case, a very interesting argument came to be, basically stating that law, by way of the statute of limitation, got in the way of justice. And some even went as far as saying that we should do away with it, and promoted the imprescriptibility of sexual felonies and crimes. There is, as we speak, a petition online that you can access that requires this very change in France because of the Bill Cosby cases. I singled out this particular petition because it listed most of the arguments I have read about in the press and heard about everywhere that crystallized the issue of imprescriptibility of sexual crimes. So let me list them, and we are going to go over them one by one later on. That petition listed 6 arguments in favor of the imprescriptibility of sex crimes and batteries. We can summarize them as follows. Number 1, sexual violence of all forms, up to and including rape, are all too common, as in France, according to the number they are using, more than 7 million people have during their lives been victims or exposed to sexual violence. Reason number 2, there is a relative impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes because only 10% of victims have the mental fortitude and courage to press charges. Reason number 3, the victims are mainly women, children, people facing discrimination, all of which making the process of coming forward with their accusations exponentially more difficult. Reason number 4, the long-lasting effects of sexual violence and the impact it has on the lives of the victims moving forward. Reason number 5, the trauma inflicted on the victims that can sometimes cause them to block the memory because it is too painful. And when it resurfaces, it is often too late with regard to the statute of limitation. And reason number 6, the general tolerance with regards to promiscuity leading to confusion as to consent. Listen, I'm not gonna lie. My natural inclination is to get on board with that petition and agree with most of these arguments. You see, despite what you may think, most lawyers went into that profession because we felt compelled to help. I would not say it's a calling. I hate when people say that it's a calling. It's not. But it's definitely a strong urge. Rape and sexual violence in general are, I believe, heinous crimes. I'm not afraid to say it. This is my personal feeling on it. And honestly, I was conflicted about even doing this episode because of that. But then, we have to put our legal hat on and examine the argument presented to decide if there is any merit to it. So, let's do that. And please really weigh in on this one. I would be so interested in reading your point of view. The first thing a lawyer will tell you is that very, very, very few crimes are imprescriptible. At the international level, for example, we are talking about crime against humanity, war crimes, which, by the way, can certainly include rape and sexual mutilation and violence, crime of aggression, and genocide. That's it. In fact, those are all the crimes that are in the purview of the International Criminal Court. All those crimes have in common certain characteristics. They affect members of a specific group, either a tribe, a country, a religious group, etc., etc. Do not get me wrong. These crimes can occur if there is only one victim, but this victim must have been chosen because of their link to a special group. Another point is that these unlawful behavior and acts are extremely rare in time and space. Thank God for that. And these are two criteria that are used to justify the imprescriptibility of these crimes. And if we are to take this as a starting point, the legal argument to make sexual violence and rape imprescriptible does not look too good. Because, as every metric shows, unfortunately, rape and sexual assault are an all too common occurrence. Let's then look at the arguments of the relative impunity for the perpetrators and the characteristics of the victims: women, children, people with disabilities, etc., etc. The issue with that contention, as it relates to imprescriptibility, of course, is that data shows that the crimes are not reported, and that is where we need to make significant progress. To what extent making these crimes imprescriptible is going to help victims coming forward, I have no idea. Real studies have to be conducted, and we have to look into that correlation. If the link exists, then I believe most people, would be on board with the idea of making it imprescriptible. Otherwise, it is kind of pointless. So, on the whole, I am a bit more comfortable with this argument than the previous one, but not by much. Then, there is the argument of the long-lasting effect of the assault or battery on the victim, which is so very important. But then again, I'm not sure I see where we are going with this from the point of view of imprescriptibility. I would certainly use this as an argument to make the sentence heavier, including an up to life sentence without parole as far as I'm concerned. It's radical, I know, but I think it's a heinous crime, as I said. But I am not sure of the correlation between the very real consequences of such a brutal crime and the option of initiating a legal action at any given time down the line. Then, there is the argument of the social tolerance towards promiscuity and the confusion of the notion of consent. Well, can that be fixed by declaring sexual crimes imprescriptible? Perhaps. I'm not sure. But perhaps. This seems like a long shot, but worth exploring, I guess. In my opinion, the best argument for this change is that of the mental block. The fact that the experience is so traumatizing and life-shattering that some way, somehow, the mind takes over to protect the body and erases it. And then, at some point, memories start to resurface and the limitation period may have expired. If you recall, some of the alleged victims of Bill Cosby have claimed just that, helped by the fact, of course, that he allegedly offered them a pill, which rendered them unable to properly consent. I see the force of that argument, I really do. One could say that a way out would be to extend the statute of limitation. But then again, we don't know how the mind works. Some victims may start to remember stuff 5, 10, or 20 years later. So, when do we decide that enough time has lapsed and we can consolidate a legal situation? Would it not be better and more just to do away with the concept of limitation entirely in that case? I do not have the answer, but it is a fundamental question. I did say that I did not have the answer, but one aspect of it is to clearly understand what purpose the doctrine of limitation serves. We can tackle that question from different points of view. From a conceptual point of view, the idea behind prescription, and here I use the term prescription as explained earlier on purpose, is that for a society to function, there must be a modicum of legal certainty to safeguard the public peace. Therefore, various interests, equivocal and potentially contentious situations must be deemed settled after a certain time. Something like, let bygones be bygones. Otherwise, it is quite simply chaos. That is one angle we can look at this from. Another angle would be the moral one, and there the image of the sword of Damocles comes to mind. The idea is that a person who feels he has been wronged cannot hold the threat of a legal action over the head of his or her alleged wrongdoer indefinitely. After a certain time has passed, society considers the matter settled by time. The length of the time depends on the nature of the alleged wrongful act. It could be 3, 5, 10, or even 30 years before a legal avenue can no longer be explored. To that argument, of course, we can oppose the argument presented earlier, talking about people who genuinely do not remember what happened to them and the unfairness that mechanism can bring to their lives, which is an absolutely valid counter-argument. To that, one can answer by saying that law cannot deal with particular cases. It must try and strike the right balance while juggling competing factors. If you want to know more about the characteristic of law, we did an episode earlier in the season, actually I think it was the second one, the chicken or the egg, that dealt with it. If we are in a situation where an important number of victims cannot remember the crimes, then the law must reflect that either by adjusting the length of the statute of limitation or abolishing it completely. Otherwise, it is difficult to make the case that the law must be changed on that basis alone. In international law, which is the focus of DOM, crimes against humanity are imprescriptible because, going back to the conceptual point of view, these acts are so heinous that no amount of time can settle the score, if you will. For the society to be able to move on, the alleged perpetrators of these crimes must answer in front of a court of law. If you are interested in this notion and the jurisprudence attached to it, you certainly can go to our website, dom-online.com, in our International and Comparative Law section, and browse notably the cases of the International Criminal Court. Alternatively, let me know in the comments if you would be interested from time to time to have an analysis of certain cases from certain tribunals. To come back to the reason prescription exists, there is a third aspect that must be considered. And, as usual, it's the most important one. It is the practical side of things. After a certain time has passed, account of witnesses may not be totally accurate and therefore reliable. Hard evidence may be less likely to be admissible depending on a myriad of procedural rules. Times may change and people may reframe certain events. To quote a phrase that has become instantly iconic, recollection may vary. We need to tread very carefully because as someone who believes in the presumption of innocence, as many others do, we value a standard of proof that is high enough to protect victims, but also does not unduly send people to prisons for acts they may not have committed. One puzzling example, and I'm going to end up on that, but I really wanted to bring that in because it really is puzzling, is the case of Roman Polanski. As you know, he has been accused of drugging and raping an underage girl in California in 1977. He was convicted on that charge, served his sentence, but decided to flee to France in the face of another trial. All of that is tragic and would warrant more time. But that's not the puzzling part. The puzzling part is that there is now a website created by someone, and I'm not going to name that person nor give the name of the website. It is very easily accessible if you're looking for it online, that is dedicated to women coming forward and detailing acts of sexual violence perpetrated by Roman Polanski. No one else. 5 women came forward in 2020. According to their testimony, the acts would have been committed between 1969 and 1976. The alleged victims are anonymous and, according to the information provided, were underage at that time. That's it. Polanski's wife alleges that the website offers money to people who would write about that. What are we to make of that? What legal force something like this could possibly have? How are we to distinguish true horror suffered by victims and unscrupulous tactics? There's simply no practical way of knowing that 40 years later. And that, in itself, is a terrible assault on justice. Thank you so much for being with us today. I want to hear what you have to say. Do you have any comments, questions? Does it make sense? Does it not? Leave a comment below the link of the episode on our social media platforms using the hashtag #LoveyLife. The transcript of the program will be available on DOM's website in both French and English. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing, liking it, and subscribing to the show. We have had some great episodes previously, and we would be delighted and grateful if you would consider listening to them. We will be back with our next episode next Wednesday. In the meantime, please stay safe and take care of yourself.